Welcome everybody. Spinner Rack in the house. The crew is in the face. Okay, in effect. But of course, we're not here to be happy. But we're here to reminisce one of the great ones who just recently passed away, Ditko himself. He helped to define some of the great comics, what a comic book is, the superhero genre that we all love and enjoy. The ones that we see on TV and movies now that everyone's following, Ditko. So I'm gonna talk to one of the guys here that I have here, Petey, Cal, and you guys we're gonna get into it a little bit, okay? You know, this is just a little reminiscent, guys. I hope you guys enjoy it. Cal, what are your thoughts on Ditko?
Well, as always,
his influence on the comic genre.
As always, with any of these guys who have made such marked and great contribution to comics, it's always sad to see them pass. Ditko for me stands alone because, unlike a lot of the other creators, Ditko's work really has to speak for itself because Ditko didn't do a lot of talking. You know, there's no video of Ditko, at least none that I've ever seen. Interviews became harder to get as Ditko progressed onwards, and that's something that I do regret. I would love to hear more of Ditko in his own words about some of his own stuff, but he didn't feel like, he didn't want to talk, and that's that. So since the work has to speak for itself, I mean, we got this great image of Spider-Man trapped underneath, tons of metal, and if you've read the story, you know that he's able to, overcome this great feat, and it's illustriously rendered by Ditko that he was able. I mean, Ditko's Spider-Man was not the Spider-Man that most people know up to now. Ditko's Spider-Man was kind of homely. He was Langley. This is a guy down on his luck. And Ditko was very interested in a lot of qualities a lot of existential qualities that I have to say were abandoned, at some point the further we go on with Spider-Man. But those early issues really had this contention between a guy who was down on his luck, and then even as a superhero, he was still down on his luck. And but with working with Stan Lee, was able to really make that, come about, make it something that people really identified with and wanted to see more of what was going to happen to Peter Parker. He goes on. I'm just trying to hit the ones that really resonated with me, but he goes on, and in the Question, not Mr. A, who I thought was even more violent than the Question, but the Question for me was such a marked departure, where Spider-Man, without a doubt, regardless of the situation, was still a good guy trying to get stuff done. The Question was a guy who was trying to get stuff done regardless of whether it was good or not. And I was very drawn to the character because I always thought, like, what's his superpower? He's got this mask where you can't see his face, and it reminded me of something of the Phantom, where you could see the Phantom, but you could never see Kit Walker. His face was always in shadow. And the Question was like that as well. But this was just a regular guy who was just going out there and knocking the nonsense out of people with nothing other than this polymer face that allowed him to, see out and nobody would know his face. And, that for me was very intriguing because, again, of the existential quality of it. Do you have to lose yourself? Do you have to abandon your own identity if you're going to go out there and seek any type of genuine justice at the end of the day? And I thought that was something that permeated all through the stories with the Question, and even more so with a character like Mr. A. And then finally, a real happy-go-lucky character that I'm pretty certain he never thought would become so beloved, Squirrel Girl, where he's responsible for the design and the creation of Squirrel Girl. But Squirrel Girl is one of the more popular characters, one of the more cosplayer favorite characters to dress up as, and one of these again, it reminds me of where a lot of people wonder, well, what was Ditko's last contribution? And if you say Squirrel Girl, they'll all perk up. They're like, Squirrel Girl, really? I was like, yeah, that was Ditko, who was doing the work at that portion. My biggest regret with Ditko is that I would have loved to have heard more from him in his own words. But hey, the work speaks for itself.
What do you think about that, B?
Oh, I think it's all strong. That's a very good, all good points and all good issues and comic characters that he did. For me, I was a kid and we get the Origin of Marvel Comics, and it has obviously all the early Marvel comics, and I really took to his Spider-Man. And then they had those other small books that had like the first 4 issues of Spider-Man, so I love reading that. So immediately in the 80s, I went to look for anything that looked like that, and the first book I found was Captain Universe, and he did 3 issues in Marvel Spotlight. So for me, that was connecting that. I mean, people would look at it and say, oh, now we, as an adult, say that's not the same as his Spider-Man. But at the same time, for me as a kid, it's like anything that looked like it. Same with Kirby. Anything that looked like what they did in the past was close enough. So that was one of my early favorites. So I would pick up anything that I would see that was close to his work. There's this creative spurt that he also, redesigned Iron Man. He, designed the Blue Beetle, the Question has just spoken in that period. And there's a couple of other obscure characters that were for like Gold Key. That really, that sort of design, the same which would happen on Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, was just in that period. I don't like when people go to the saying lightning didn't strike twice for him, because the design of the Blue Beetle is capturing some of those elements that we saw in Spider-Man. And then I would go to his work on Warren, like a lot of the horror stuff, doing a departure from Marvel. And that's, that work is as strong as anything he did for Marvel. So I don't like to look at it and say, obviously Spider-Man, it would be his top work, but he continued working up until now, self-publishing, and I've always been a fan of his work. And you go back further, you go back to his Atlas work, which Marvel. You can see a lot of stuff that they took to use for the Twilight Zone, because that lighting, like EC Comics did the lighting, but like Marvel, they really pushed it with the comic book color and the solid colors, and that sort of harsh lighting that they used in Atlas Comics is what you can really see in, I think Arlen Schumer, he did a little something on stuff that EC and Marvel and the 50s comics sort of translated into the Twilight Zone. So I've been a fan all of my life. I continue to read his self-published, and some of his writings. It's very long-winded, but as it goes along, I mean, I pick up more pieces, and I was like, oh man, it's like instead of laboring through, it's like, oh man, there's another strong point here. There's another strong point here. And he's given us some tidbits about his history with Marvel, more so than Stan Lee or Jack Kirby, because they just didn't have the best of memories. And he had a closer idea of what happened in the past, whereas historians will say they had the worst memories ever. So, I've always been a big fan, And funny, I read there's essential volumes of Spider-Man. I read those when I was in my 20s, and I saw Peter Parker graduate from high school, and Liz Allen is like sort of not looking at him, and this is when he's plotting the book, and Peter Parker approaches her, and she's like, oh, I was just some sort of silly girl. You never really, paid attention to, but I was really interested in you, but I got to go on in my life. I'm not going to college. And she's like, well, and Peter's like, wait. And there's moments where I feel like, oh man, I should have paid attention to this person. It really connected to me. I was like, this is almost like, this is more interesting than the Spider-Man stuff, the Peter Parker stuff, and him when he meets Gwen Stacy. He doesn't notice her, but she's interested, and he sort of blows her off, but not knowing. And then when they meet, and I think that happened to me at the job, where I was like, oh man, and I meet someone and just like, and she like sort of pushed at me, and I'm like, well, I didn't do anything. It's like, no, you saw me the other day, you didn't say nothing. I'm like, don't just stare. Like, oh yeah, oh man, I'm sorry. So it really connected with his style, and I think he should have done more romance stuff, even though people won't say that he's always been the good girl artist. If you look at those pages of Liz Allen and Betty Brant, and even, and he introduced Mary Jane in a panel, but you don't see her face, and those sort of dynamics were very strong. So I've always been a fan of his work. With Fangraphix, they have a couple of I think it's World of Ditko, and they also have reprints of his old stuff from Charlton that you can go out and get. So I've gotten most of those books, and there are more coming out. So it's a loss, but it's a very good, a strong run, strong commitment to, being a creator, and a strong legacy. That's all I can say.
So what do you think was his impact on some like Peter Parker or Doctor Strange or Iron Man or any other particular title?
Or the Hulk. The Hulk was, the elements of the Hulk that work are already there in the first 6 issues, but it failed. And what Ditko and Stan did together, I think they were asking what other book did he want to do. They sort of put it back to Banner being the character, and being Hulk being the character, but having Banner and Hulk having that dynamic, because it kind of lost that by issue 3. It was more Hulk and Rick Jones, and Banner was sort of like a side character. And at least, even though it was mostly Hulk, it had a lot of Banner when Ditko started. I think it's only for like 8 to 10 issues, but that dynamic of Banner's struggle, tragedy of having the Hulk, ran for up until Peter David took over the book, and changed the dynamic to getting back to that darker gray Hulk. So that sort of dynamic of what you can do, and besides obviously the dynamic of Spider-Man, that's nothing. The whole motion. I think Paul Smith talked about his character had movement a little more like it was Jack Kirby's characters had power, and Ditko's characters had movement, and how he sort of suggested movement. So that dynamic, even though you can go as far as anatomy, you go to John Romita and you're like, wow, I really enjoy his Spider-Man. But still the web slinging, the traveling over New York City, all of that stuff, that initial dynamic is Ditko, and then just carried on by so many great artists, after him.
What about you, Cal? What do you think?
He has a lot of fluidity with his art as the story goes, Jack Kirby is the first person tapped to do the design for Spider-Man. And when Stan Lee gets it, he's like, no, we can't do this, because he's like, no, this looks too much like a superhero, and that's not what the character's supposed to be. So he taps Ditko. And if you look at especially those early issues, because there's a marked difference between what Romita was doing and what Ditko was doing. But those early issues, Spider-Man is more, I don't want to say gangly, but he's leaner. And the whole idea is you're trying to come across, he's supposed to be a Spider-Man, okay? He's supposed to come across like a spider, okay, with that fluidity of movement as a spider would come across. Not this, muscular, powerful thing, but something that would look a little bit more spindly, slippery, and spooky at the end of the day when it's coming across. Because when villains, now, when I was reading some of the Spider-Man issues with Romita, and a villain would see Spider-Man and they're, running off, okay? They're running off because it's Spider-Man, and like, oh, Spider-Man's gonna catch us. Whereas opposed to where you see Spider-Man that first time, especially in that first issue, Amazing Fantasy 15, where he's going after the criminal, and the guy's scared of him because of the way he looks. He looks eerie. He looks creepy. From those, like, trying to almost come out of those same horror comics where it's this Spider-Man, but he's not an actual guy changing into a spider. The costume and the the movement, and the poses, all of that works.
That's what I feel about the Iron Spider.
A lot of that we lose a lot of that. I thought we got some of that back when he changed to the black costume, which is closer to the eeriness that was a little bit of what you got in those early Spider-Man issues, because then it becomes a lot more superheroic. But those earlier issues, Spider-Man was this guy who would creep you out. He was crawling on a wall, and I think Ditko understood how freaky that would be to see someone crawling on. Did you see Split?
Yes.
You remember the scene with the guy's like he's climbing the wall, and you're looking like how eerie, almost icky it is to see a human being do something like that, because it's so close to a reptile or an insect, which we have a natural revulsion or repulsion of. Yeah. So I thought he did an excellent job in bringing that sort of stuff out. And then his characters, if you look, even up to Captain Universe, these almost look like civilians in superhero garb. Okay, they didn't look like superheroes per se. The Question is wearing a suit. Captain Universe, has on one of those, superhero outfits, but not the bulging, almost, Arnold Schwarzenegger type builds that you would see with them, but the movement, the angles, that he would use in terms of his artwork, something that doesn't necessarily influence a lot of these superhero comic books. But you could definitely see it today in a whole bunch of the independent stuff that you would go. Don't look any further than Walking Dead if you want to see somebody who has really studied Ditko's work, okay, and applied it right over there. The whole idea is to try to capture someone. Again, there's still a bit of a simpler form to it, but looking for someone who's trying to do a minimalist form, almost an impressionist form, if you will, when it comes to people, and then displaying that in the art form of comic books.
Interesting. That's pretty cool. Well, thank you. You guys have anything else to bring into this?
I guess the last would be a lot is said about his political views being an objectivist, but I don't think that comes into play when there's like hundreds of post-Marvel Charlton books that he did in the 70s. So it's like, he had the political things, but he's working with the writer Joe Gill, who was the main writer at that, and he was happy to do comics. He just came into a disagreement, which was not political, between him and Stan Lee. That's why he was. And then he came back, and he had he had some ideals, but at the same time he did Machine Man. He did a bunch of different things for Marvel, and then he did obviously the Creeper, and I put Creeper in the with the Blue Beetle and those characters. It's an odd character. I think there's always a strong, there's something in there, even with there's always going to be something in there with a Ditko character. So it's always going to be something you could pull out and find it interesting. And so I think there's just too many comics to look from the 70s to 80s to be like, oh, his political views. When you had the Blue Beetle, you had the Question, you had Mr. A, but you also had the Blue Beetle. And the only difference is that he was more of an adult character. He was a more serious character, nothing like he was in the Justice League. Like the Blue Beetle is a scientist, he has a girlfriend, and they're struggling with his identity, and it has nothing to do with any sort of political stuff. But then it's like, oh my gosh, the political stuff just kept creeping in, and they're like, yeah, you're forcing it now.
That's the postmodernist reader response type of,
yeah.
A lot of guys will apply to it, which is a shame because they're not reading it for what it is, they're reading for what they can get out of it. And that's not necessarily, I mean, look, you get a bowl of soup and tomato soup. You have to be able to say, okay, this is tomato soup at the end of the day, as opposed to, this tastes a little bit like duck soup. If you think about it, it's like, no, that's not necessarily the way it works. I think it's very easy to separate whatever his political views from what you saw in terms of the comics. He was professional too, so he would have had to do something that was really independent for you to really get a lot of that his political policies out of the work. The only other thing would have been, I wish that for the most part, I think Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were able to somehow get to some sort of, equilibrium between the two of them. That never happened with Stan Lee and Ditko, to the best of my knowledge. I mean, they had two moments, I think, in the 80s when he was working with Marvel, and they got them in the room, and they were pushing them to do something together, and it fell through. But that gave them a grace period. And then the only problem is that, Stan has a bad memory. So there'd be these things that would pop up, and then Ditko would respond, but they were still in a grace period. So then I think Ditko called Stan and said, hey, can you write a letter so I can put in a book saying, that I'm the Crow creator. And he's like, yeah, I'll do that. But then he wrote Considered, and then that sort of set Ditko off, and he said, considered the co-creator, that's like the ponder. And then of course we were like, hey, Ditko went a little too far, until Search for Ditko, where Stan was like, he asked him about it, and he said, you consider, but could you go differently then? He said, well, I consider him that, but I think the guy who dreams it up is the guy. Now you guys, and I was like, oh no, Stan, no. So I mean, they had a little bit of grace period, but it came back when the considered line. So. Well, it's difficult. It's difficult, especially when you throw. It's difficult when you throw in I don't think Ditko didn't litigate, but it's difficult when you have a bad break and you can never really reestablish trust again. That is the only thing. At the end of the day, because I don't know. I mean, because I can't tell if he's really jabbing at him. Because Stan will do that. I can't tell if he's really jabbing at him at that portion. And then on Ditko's part, I'm like, look, if this is the best that you're going to get, that's the best that you're going to get at the end of the day. The history speaks for itself. Everybody knows what the involvement is. We know who's on record. We know who's on. People have been on record with the contribution, okay, and what it was that you did with Spider-Man. There's nothing more that can be done at the end of the point. But then I also have to say, look, if that was the crucial thing and you didn't get it, then you didn't get it, and that's where the relationship ends at the end.
But why couldn't the artists back then and the writers back then, the creators basically get together and stand united?
A lot of people thought, people think, Stan is wealthy. Stan is middle management. Okay, Stan is middle management. He came over because he was more jocular, and he became the face of Marvel. And when they decided, okay, we're going to sell off, they were like, yeah, we're bringing him along too, because he became so synonymous with Marvel Comics at the end of the day. But it wasn't like, okay, Stan was getting this, great, Stan was like making millions of dollars and everybody else got turned out. Dude was middle management. He still had to come in and report for work like everybody else. He had to push books. He had to make these particular decisions. So things didn't go right, things didn't go right between the two of them. It's not like, hey, Stan can come over here, and, well, I'm going to come over here and, fight. Stan can get turned out just like everybody else at the end of the day. The only thing that gave him a little bit more strength was the fact that he had been doing these lecture circuits, and people, identified with Stan's soapbox and the Merry Marvel Marching Society, all that stuff from over here in terms of promoting those comics, got him with got him to be the face on it. Then you compare that with someone like Jack Kirby, who wasn't necessarily as jocular when he was time to speak to people, or someone like Steve Ditko, who didn't want to speak to people at all.
Well, I want to add exactly to that point is that not only was there the soapbox and the lectures we know about, there's the lectures earlier where he was just sort of almost like a college professor, where there's videos online in the 60s when he was doing Marvel where he would just conduct the class, not the one where he's doing the jokes. He would have a lecture that was just a solid lecture. So he already had the chops. And then of course, as you were saying, him being the success of creating his own identity as a personality, that was what people wanted to buy into. But also at the look with Ditko, when he broke from them, everyone's added in that he wanted money and this, that, and the other. And all he was the working relationship didn't work. So it was like, hey, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing Spider-Man. And I'm guessing Marvel somehow, compensated him some way because somehow he was, just living in New York City all this time.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he wasn't fighting and saying, I guess like Alan Moore, tearing down Marvel. He was just like, they do this. I don't like that Joe Quesada said, you're breaking the toys. That's what, he wasn't going in saying, they're taking the credit, I got nothing. And also it's tough because with Kirby, was a lot of people in his ear saying, you did this, Stan is just blah, blah. And then at times there's a point where they say, and I mean, there's no documented thing, but even then there's a radio, and when Jack Kirby's birthday, when Stan and Jack are arguing for a little point about who did what, and then they calm down, and they're friendly again. And it's like, everything I did for you, Stan, and they're like, yeah, Jack, you were always the greatest, and it calms down. So if you get the guys in the room, there's a chance that it could calm down. But once you try to decide that Jack did everything, and Steve Ditko never said
camps. Once they go to their respective camps, it gets really, really dodgy. And I don't, like I said, the work speaks. I think the work speaks for itself. You see what type of synergy you get. I hate to say, you see the type of synergy you get with Stan Lee and these guys over here, and the selection of talent, who's going to go where, do what, what he was going to do and what they were going to do. And we get the Marvel Universe out of that whole stuff. And then we see what everybody does, without what Stan does on his own, without necessarily those type of players, what those players do on their own, without necessarily Stan. I mean, it was just it was a once in a lifetime thing. It's a once in a lifetime thing at the end of the day. And, you can't go back and say, well, hey, why didn't we do this? Because the only reason why you're doing this in 1988 or 2018 is because of what those guys did in 1968. You can't go back and, you just can't go back and get it.
Well, you have to look at also that DC made the big hit with the Flash and the Justice League and Green Lantern. They had the big hit, and then Marvel comes out of nowhere and makes a huge leap in creativity. Copying them from the Justice League with the Fantastic Four, then Spider-Man. And then when people I think the first to be there for 2 seconds is Wally Wood, and then make a comic company, Tower, he can't compete with Marvel. And then Steve Ditko does other books. Those books can't compete with Marvel. And then Kirby goes, and it's like
Kirby went to DC.
And it's like
and he couldn't compete with his past stuff.
That's the other thing. Ditko and Kirby are competing with the reprints of their books and the continuing Spider-Man going on past them.
And then Kirby comes back to Marvel, and he can't compete with the stuff he did with DC or his earlier Marvel work. It's it's just
that unique combination of what occurred at that time. Definitely helped. That little bubble.
What did they say? Michael Jackson passed away. It was Barry Gordy. He said some things come. He said some things come, once in a generation. Some things come once in a lifetime, and some things just come once. They just come once. That's what That's what it is. We get to benefit from it, but I don't see it happening again.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for discussing Ditko and the comic book industry. Listen, guys, subscribe. Speed and Rack out.